You're really comfortable there, aren't you?
Very. Your heartbeat is calmer than you are.
I'm trying my best. What does choosing me mean?
It means I trust you with my heart.
Why me?
It means my heart feels safe with you.
Then stay. I don't want you moving away.
Good, because your chest is still my favorite pillow.
The bunk smelled like someone else's sleep, and the someone in question had already claimed the wall side. Marcus Webb stood in the doorway of compartment 14 with his kit bag over one shoulder and a transfer order in his hand that assigned him, clearly and without apology, to the top rack in a room built for two that was currently housing 6. The UNS Meridian had taken a 40-millimeter rail round through its port crew section 3 weeks prior, and the resulting cascade of reassignments had apparently concluded that a staff sergeant's preference for sleeping in a straight line was a secondary consideration to keeping the manifest balanced. He looked at the bunk. The small occupant of the lower rack looked back at him from behind eyes that were roughly twice the diameter Marcus considered standard, the color of old honey in failing light, and entirely without apology. "That one is yours," she said, and pointed up. Her voice carried something beneath it, a very faint harmonic below the spoken words, like the resonant note a cello string leaves in the air after the bow is lifted. Marcus filed it under things he'd address later and stepped fully into the compartment. The other 4 racks were occupied by bodies in various states of sleep, none of whom appeared interested in the transfer of territorial rights happening in their corner of the room. "And you know that, because," he said, "because he was too tired to skip straight to acceptance. Because you are carrying exactly 1 kit bag. Your rank markings indicate enlisted rather than officer. And the 3 commissioned personnel in this compartment have already claimed the more ergonomically advantageous positions. The only unoccupied rack is that one." She pointed up back in time, patient as a mathematician repeating a self-evident proof. Logic. Marcus looked at her for a moment, veil, based on the bone structure finely built, high-cheeked, with a quality of physical precision that made most of their movements look slightly deliberate, as if each one had been selected from a catalog of possible movements and chosen for efficiency. Her skin held a faint iridescence that was only visible when the corridor light caught her from the right angle, a shimmer somewhere between silver and amber that came and went too quickly to stare at directly. She had her hair pulled back in some arrangement he couldn't fully parse, and she was wrapped in a thermal blanket that covered her up to the collarbone. Despite the blanket, she was shivering slightly, the fine, continuous shiver of someone who has been cold long enough to accept it as a background condition of existence. The meridian ran at 14 degrees Celsius through its occupied sections, because fuel cost money and warmth was a luxury the coalition allocated selectively. Marcus had long since stopped noticing it. He set down his kit bag, climbed the ladder, and lay on a mattress that was approximately the width of a sincere intention and smelled faintly of recycled air and institutional laundry. The ceiling was close enough to touch without extending his arm. "Welcome," said the alien woman below him, in a tone that suggested welcome was a courtesy rather than a sentiment, and went back to the translation module in her lap. Marcus stared at the ceiling and arrived, with the particular exhaustion of a man who has stopped expecting things to be easy, at the conclusion that this was fine. He'd slept worse than a bunk aboard a military transport. He'd slept in places that were actively trying to kill him. A small alien who used formal logic as a greeting was not, by any reasonable measure, a problem. He was asleep in under 7 minutes. She tapped on the underside of his mattress at 0300. The tap was small and deliberate, 2 fingers in a specific pattern, and Marcus went from full sleep to sitting upright in the time it took his nervous system to register the difference between ambient ship noise and intentional contact. 12 years of service had calibrated him. For exactly this, he sat up, registered the compartment low light, 5 other breathing patterns, no threat indicators, and looked over the edge of the bunk. She was looking up at him, The thermal blanket was wrapped entirely around her, including over the top of her head, so that only her face was visible in the narrow frame of it. Her honey-colored eyes catching what little light the emergency strips provided, and giving it back amplified, the way eyes do when they've evolved for low-light environments. "It is very cold," she said. Marcus looked at her. He looked at the 2 feet of empty space beside him in the bunk. He looked back at her. "How cold does your species run?" he said. Because he had found over the years that understanding the problem was generally more useful than objecting to it. "Our homeworld maintains an ambient temperature of 23 degrees Celsius, with peaks near 31 during midday cycle," she said. "Our thermoregulation functions adequately within 4 degrees of that range. Below 12, we experience significant metabolic disruption." A pause. "This ship maintains 14 degrees. I have been operating at the low edge of functional thermoregulation for 9 hours. And the blanket isn't enough. The blanket is rated to provide insulation at 14 degrees. I am already at 14 degrees." She said this simply, without complaint, as if she were describing a shipping manifest error rather than a physiological crisis. The thermal differential required for adequate regulation must come from an external source. Marcus exhaled. He moved to the wall side and left the outer edge of the bunk open. She was up the ladder and settled against his side before he'd fully processed the decision to make it. She weighed roughly what a large child would weigh, which startled him slightly. He'd known she was small, but there was a quality of lightness to veil bone structure that translated to almost nothing when it was pressed against your ribs. She was cold through the double layer of her blanket, and his cold enough that he felt it, and she pressed her face into his chest, into the space just below his shoulder. And the sound she made was not quite a sigh and not quite a low note of relief, but something between the two, carrying in it the specific exhaustion of a person who has been enduring something alone for a long time and has been briefly, unexpectedly, relieved of it. "This is sufficient," she said, against his shirt. "Good," Marcus said. "Your core temperature is stable. The output is consistent." A pause. "The resonance is also correct." She pressed her left hand flat against his sternum as she said it, palm open, fingers spread slightly, in a way that felt less like seeking warmth and more like someone reading a signal through a surface, like someone listening through a wall for something specific they expected to find on the other side. He didn't ask what resonance meant. He filed it alongside the harmonic in her voice and let sleep come back for him, which it did in under 4 minutes. Because his body had a highly developed sense of which problems required immediate attention and which ones could wait until he had more information to work with. The warmth in his chest where her hand rested was specific and settled in a way that struck him, from the receding edge of consciousness, as slightly unusual deeper than the warmth of another person's proximity, more interior. Like something had been placed there carefully and left to breathe in the dark. He noted it distantly, and then stopped noting anything at all. He would remember it in the morning. He would find every morning after that the memory of it was slightly more precise than the morning before. Her name was Yael. He learned this the following morning when she was already awake and had left the translation module open on the lower bunk with the suggestion offered, without particular affect, that mutual comprehension would reduce inefficiency between bunkmates. He agreed to this proposition because it was logically sound, and because Corporal Elena Vasquez was waiting in the corridor outside with 2 cups of ship coffee and an expression of suppressed amusement. "New bunkmate," Vasquez said, handing him the left cup and making it sound like a complete sociological observation. "Thermal redistribution issue," Marcus said. "Sure." Vasquez sipped her coffee. She was from somewhere coastal, originally, and had the kind of practical directness that people who grew up near the water tended to develop a sense that conditions changed constantly, and the smart move was to adapt rather than resist. She had been on 3 deployments with Marcus and was the closest thing he currently had to a friend, which they both understood without having discussed it. Vale. Right. I looked it up in the passenger advisory database. They're warm-adapted homeotherms. Their thermoregulation is efficient within their native range, but bottoms out fast in cold environments. Below 15 degrees, they start having real trouble. This ship runs at 14, Marcus said. Yeah. She considered her cup, so she needed the body heat. Which makes sense. But there's also apparently something specific about human bioelectric output that Veil thermal receptors respond to. Something about the frequency range. Human bioelectricity is, I don't know the technical term, apparently a particularly good match for how Veil biology is designed to receive thermal input. Marcus thought about the word Yale had used, pressed flat-handed against his sternum with the specific attention of someone locating a signal. Resonance is also correct. Where'd you read that? He said. Xenobiology Supplemental. It's in the passenger interaction advisories in the ship's database. Vasquez looked at him steadily over the rim of her cup. You should read those. He told her he would. He meant it. He did not immediately do it. The Galactic Registry Bureau agents came aboard at waypoint Sigma 7, while the Meridian was docked for refueling 3 days into the journey. There were 3 of them administrative staff in the pale gray of the Bureau's official uniform. The lead was Drev, and Marcus recognized the species by the height, the angular economy of the facial structure, and the quality of the eyes, which were the color of a sky that had been drained of weather. Not cold, precisely, but categorically without the particular property that makes eyes appear interested in the world they're looking at. The Galactic Registry Bureau maintained legal audit authority aboard any registered vessel in transit, and it was an authority they exercised with the confidence of an institution that had been exercising it for roughly 2,000 years. Marcus was assigned to manifest duty in the cargo bay while the ship was docked, which gave him a tablet and a secondary supply manifest, and a clear line of sight to the GRB team, working through the primary manifest with the Meridian's operations officer. He watched them the way he watched most things in unfamiliar situations, which was without appearing to watch at all. The lead agent moved through the crew and personnel sections with professional efficiency. The cargo manifest he covered at approximately the same pace. When he reached the refugee and unregistered species passenger section, his pace decreased by perhaps 5%. A reduction so small that a person not specifically measuring it would not notice it at all. He paused on one entry. The pause lasted less than 2 seconds. His expression registered nothing. Before Marcus had finished counting the second tier of supply crates, the lead agent had sent a compressed signal burst from his personal communications unit. Tight bandwidth. Narrow band. Encrypted. Marcus only knew it had gone out because he'd been watching for it. Watching, the way the agent's eyes had moved to the unit for one fraction of a second before the screen dimmed again, and because 12 years in environments where understanding the communications landscape was the difference between walking out and being carried out, had given him reflexes he no longer needed to consciously deploy. He finished counting the second tier. He started on the third. He said nothing. He found Yael on the observation deck before the dinner rotation, pressed against the viewport with her knees pulled to her chest and her hands tucked under her arms. The thermal blanket was wrapped around her shoulders again. The stars moved slowly past the scratched plexiglass, and she was watching them with an attention that had something of memory in it, or of counting, or of both. He sat down beside her. At the distance, 2 people sit when they've spent 3 days learning each other's habits without fully deciding to, not touching. And looked at the stars, too. They were quiet for a time. It was not an uncomfortable quiet. The lead agent, she said, eventually, without looking at him. He found something in my file. Standard audit, Marcus said. He sent a compressed signal before the audit was completed. She said this, without emphasis. With the precision of someone reporting a measurement, I observed the transmission indicator on his communications unit. My people taught me to recognize that type of signal. They taught me what it means when someone finds what they were looking for and needs to report it before completing the official process. Marcus said nothing for a moment. He watched the stars wheel. "What are you carrying?" he asked. He wasn't sure why he asked it. Perhaps because he'd been thinking, since the previous night, about the way her hand had rested against his sternum with that specific, listening quality, not seeking warmth, but finding something she'd been looking for. Yale turned to look at him. In the observation deck's dim light, the iridescence in her skin was more visible than in compartment 14's functional lighting, as a soft shift of silver and copper that moved when she moved, like light seen through shallow water. "Before I answer that," Fi said, "I want to ask you something." "Go ahead," he said. "Your service record includes a formal insubordination notation, approximately 2 years ago, against an otherwise clean file." She said it with the directness of someone who sees no reason to approach a subject from an indirect angle when the direct one is available. "What was the order you refused to follow?" Marcus was quiet for longer than he'd expected to be. "I wasn't given an order I refused," he said. "Finally, I was given an order I followed. Hold a position. Strategic value." The rationale was sound on paper. The situation changed faster than the order accounted for. "I held it anyway." He looked at the stars. "3 of my people died because I chose the order over what was actually in front of me. And the insubordination was afterward," she said. "I told my commanding officer, formally and on record, that the intelligence briefing underlying that order was outdated, and that the person who approved it without updating it was directly responsible for the outcome." A pause. Apparently, that characterization was not the preferred interpretation of events. "So, you follow orders," she said. "I follow good orders," he said. She turned this over for a moment, in the way she examined things that mattered. "Not quickly, and not casually. The last census my people completed," she said then, "recorded 236,411 living Vael. That was 4 years ago." She looked at the stars. "I have not encountered another living Vael in 26 months. I carry what remains. Everything my people were, their history, their science, their art, their language, their names encoded in the living tissue of my nervous system. I am the last bearer." She paused. "I am also the last piece of evidence that someone with considerable institutional power had a reason to ensure my people disappeared. The agent who flagged my file was looking for me specifically because the Bureau has been tracking the remaining bearers for 3 years. And I am the last one whose file is still open." Marcus heard the specific weight of what she wasn't saying. "The others," he said. "What does a closed file mean?" The pause was very small, and in it, he understood. "They close the files," she said. "When there is nothing more to track." They sat on the observation deck for another 10 minutes after that, not talking, while the stars moved at their ancient, indifferent pace past the scratched plexiglass of a transport vessel that smelled of recycled air and institutional laundry, and was carrying in compartment 14 the last surviving memory of 236,000 people. The notification from the Galactic Registry Bureau appeared in Marcus's administrative queue at 2100, flagged yellow. Standard format, requesting confirmation of continued presence and cooperative status for passenger 4,417 Yale. Vale Refugee Class. He sat in the crew mess with the notification on his tablet and a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and he looked at it for a long time. He thought about 236,411. He thought about the precision of that number, and about the fact that she had given it to him without pause, which meant she had been keeping it alive in herself for 26 months, the way you keep something alive when it's the only record of its kind, carefully, and all the time, and because there is no one else to do it. He thought about the lead agent's 2-second pause over her file and the compressed signal and the quality of attention the agent had given to that single entry out of hundreds. He thought about Kerrigan Station and about the specific shape of what it felt like to look at a decision in your rear view and understand what you chose when you chose the easy thing. The notification had a 2-minute completion time. The form was standard. The yellow flag would resolve to green, and the matter would transfer to bureau jurisdiction, which was where procedure said it belonged, which was where 12 years of service told him to send it. Marcus submitted the form at 21:14. He confirmed her cooperative status. He went to bed. He lay awake for a long time, looking at the ceiling. The spot on his chest where her hand had rested was warm, in a way that was distinct from simple body heat. Something more interior, more persistent, like a specific frequency, had been established there and was continuing quietly without his input. He noticed it. He had no explanation for it. He fell asleep and did not dream. In the morning, something had changed that he couldn't immediately locate. Not the warmth, which was still there, not his understanding, which hadn't yet expanded to accommodate what was happening. Something else, a shift in the interior weather of the specific kind that follows a decision whose full weight you haven't yet finished receiving. He went to find Vasquez. He told her about the compressed signal. He did not tell her about the form he'd submitted. The GRB agents did not leave at waypoint Sigma 7. This was, technically, within their authority. The Registry Bureau maintained the right of operational presence aboard any vessel in transit when an active documentation verification was underway, and the verification attached to passenger 4,417. Yael had entered what the lead agent Cast described to Captain Okonkwo's first officer as a detail review requiring extended presence. The Meridian's Captain Sadia Okonkwo, 15 years of command, a practical intelligence, and a very precise sense of what warranted her direct attention, had been informed of the extension, and had provided the Bureau team with temporary berths near the secondary manifest office, because the Bureau's authority was legitimate, and her record was clean, and she intended to keep it that way. Marcus found out about the extended stay from Vasquez, who had found out from the operations clerk, who had found out because it was the clerk's job to know where every person aboard the ship was sleeping. Extended verification, Vasquez said. They were in the port corridor during the first break rotation, and she was using the voice she used when she was choosing her words with more attention than usual. That can cover a lot of territory. What does it cover here? Marcus said. It means they're not done, and they're not leaving until they are. She looked at him steadily. Did you file the flag last night? Yes, he said. Resolved green. Yes, he said. She nodded slowly. The nod of a person deciding whether to say the thing they're thinking. She decided to. Here's something you should know about GRB jurisdiction over unregistered biological heritage material, she said. They can't compel testimony without a full council authorization, which takes time and has oversight built into it. But they can compel documentation review without any external approval, and under the Heritage Preservation Ordinance, the specific clause that covers biological encoding in living bearers. They have the authority to take physical custody of heritage material if it's assessed to be at risk of loss due to the terminal status of the last known bearer. She held his gaze. Terminal status means dead or legally incapacitated. She's not terminal, Marcus said. Right now she's not, Vasquez said. They looked at each other for a moment that had more in it than either of them chose to put into words. How long until Jericho Station? Marcus said. 4 days, she said. And Jericho has a full bureau extraction facility. He let the word extraction sit with him for a moment. Tell me that means what I think it means, he said, and not what I'm afraid it means. Vasquez's expression answered him. The formal verification interview happened the following morning in the small meeting room adjacent to the secondary manifest office. Marcus knew it was happening because he was passing the corridor at the relevant time, and he saw Yael entering the room ahead of Kost, and the way she walked precise, contained. Each step chosen made him think of someone crossing ground they've assessed as dangerous without allowing the assessment to alter their pace. He kept walking. He went to his assigned duty rotation. He spent 43 minutes cataloging repair components in Bay 3 and running a parallel thought process that he could not quite call planning because it hadn't fully resolved into a plan yet, only into a conclusion, which was that a verification interview with two Field Division security officers in operational charcoal standing outside the door was not a verification interview. At the 43-minute mark, he set down his tablet and went back down the corridor. The two field officers read him immediately, and he read them back. And what passed between all of them in that fraction of a second was the specific mutual assessment of people with combat experience establishing the parameters of a situation before anyone says anything. Restricted access, the left officer said. Verification in progress. I'm the assigned housing contact, Marcus said. Section 8 of the Passenger Management Protocol gives me procedural standing for welfare access. Section 8 requires a request from the passenger. Section 8 allows the housing contact to initiate on a reasonable inference of welfare concern when the passenger is unavailable to initiate directly. Marcus said. He had, in fact, spent the 43 minutes in Bay 3 reading the Passenger Management Protocol on his tablet, which Vasquez had flagged and forwarded to him at 0650 with a message that contained only the section numbers. The right officer shifted his weight fractionally toward the balls of his feet, which was not a threatening movement, technically, and was also not nothing. The left officer spoke quietly into his unit. After a moment, the door opened. Yale sat across a small table from Cast, with the second field officer positioned near the room's interior wall in the specific way that a person stands near a wall when their purpose is to make sure the door doesn't become an exit. Cast had a documentation terminal, and the expression of someone conducting a process he has conducted many times. Yale looked at Marcus when he came in. Her expression didn't visibly change. She communicated through posture, through the angle of her attention, through subtle adjustments that he was slowly learning to read. What he read in that moment was, "You came." And underneath it, with less surface area than the first thing. "I did not expect that. This interview is restricted," Cast said. "I have procedural standing as the housing contact," Marcus said, and sat down in the empty chair beside Yael, without being invited to, and placed his hands flat on the table in the way that said clearly, "I'm not threatening. I'm also not leaving. And I'd like to see the exact citation that requires me to do anything other than sit here. I believe there's a Bureau Provision Section 14, if I recall correctly, that allows a passenger's designated contact to remain present during extended verification review." He had not recalled correctly. He had guessed. But he had also spent enough time dealing with bureaucratic authority structures to know that asserting a supporting clause with confidence was frequently enough to cause a pause while the other party determined whether you were right. And a pause was what he needed. Cast looked at him for a moment, running the calculation behind those pale eyes. Section 14, Cast said, applies specifically to medical or psychological welfare documentation. She has been operating below her species' minimum thermal threshold for approximately 96 hours, Marcus said. I'm prepared to characterize that as a physiological welfare concern if it would help clarify my standing. Another pause, longer this time. Cast turned back to the terminal and continued the interview. And he did not ask Marcus to leave. Marcus sat. Yale did not look at him again during the interview, which lasted another 22 minutes and consisted of Cast asking very precise questions about the nature, extent, and accessible scope of what he referred to as the biological heritage material she was registered as carrying questions that were detailed and clearly informed by significant prior research, and Yale giving answers that were technically complete, individually accurate, and collectively useless, in the way that a map of a city that shows only the streets and none of the buildings is technically accurate. When it was over and they were in the corridor, she said quietly, "You were not required to do that." "No," he said. "It will likely complicate your record." "Probably," he said. She looked at him with those eyes that gathered ambient light and gave it back amplified, and for a moment he had the strange sensation that she was reading him the way she read his chest when she slept, not with her eyes, exactly, but with something that used the eyes as its nearest available instrument. Why? She said. He thought about it honestly before he answered. Because there were two field officers in operational gear outside the door of a documentation interview, he said. That's not documentation. She was quiet then. You are the first person in 26 months who has noticed the difference between what something is called and what it is. They walked back to compartment 14 without speaking further, and that night she slept against his side again. And when she pressed her face into his chest, the sound she made was slightly different from the nights before. Not less exhausted, but less isolated in its exhaustion, as if the exhaustion now had a context to exist in rather than a void. He lay awake for a while after she'd fallen asleep. The warmth in his chest, where her hand rested, was settling deeper every night. Or perhaps he was simply noticing it more completely. He couldn't determine which. He had a dream he wouldn't fully recover in the morning. Something red and very tall, moving in wind that didn't have the right sound. Warm light from an angle he didn't recognize as any sun he'd ever worked under. And beneath it all, a sound he could feel in his sternum more than hear with his ears. Too low for his normal audio range, but precisely within the range of whatever the warmth in his chest was doing. Low and continuous and alive. He woke at 04:30 with his heartbeat elevated and an absolute certainty that he had been somewhere real, combined with the specific frustration of not being able to bring it back into language. He told himself it was stress. He had two GRB field officers living on his transport, and a woman sleeping against his side who was the last of her people and carrying all of them. His brain processing that sideways into dreams was not a remarkable development. He did not mention the dream to Yale at breakfast. He almost mentioned it at lunch when she was at the far end of the mess table with her translation module, and she looked up when he sat down and said, "Without preamble, you look tired," and he said, "Difficult night," and she said, "I know," in a tone that made him set down his coffee. "How do you know?" he said. She looked at him for a moment, and then at the module, and then back up. The decision she was making was visible in the quality of her stillness, the particular stillness of someone determining how complete an answer to give. When the resonance shifts, she said carefully, "I can sense it. The frequency changes when you are restless." "I notice." "The resonance," he said. "You've used the word before. It is the closest available translation. What does it actually mean?" "Inveil." She was quiet for a moment in the specifics of someone working through a true answer rather than a convenient one. "There is a process my people developed across many generations for preserving knowledge in a medium that cannot be lost, the way physical media can be lost," she said. "A living medium. Our biology evolved alongside this process. We generate what your scientists call a bioelectric field, and within that field, at a specific frequency, we encode information that becomes part of the living electrical pattern of a compatible host, not stored inside them. The way you store data in a device, carried, the way a river carries what it runs over. Both the river and what it carries are real at the same time, in the same place." Marcus looked at her across the mess table. "Compatible," he said. "Yes," she said. "What species are compatible?" She looked at him with an expression that was still and honest, and waited with something she wasn't ready to say yet. "That," she said, "is a longer conversation, and I am not yet certain we have the time for longer conversations." She went back to the module. He finished his coffee. They sat together in the mess until their separate rotations called them, and neither of them said anything further, and, in the quiet between them, Marcus was aware, as he was aware of it every hour now, of the warmth in his chest that was specific and settled and belonged to a frequency he still didn't have a word for. The Meridian entered the communications dead zone at 1700 that day, standard navigational transit procedure. The ship's intercom announced it in Captain Okonkwo's even tones as routine. The GRB agents were still aboard. They had already been aboard for 2 days past waypoint Sigma 7. But when the communications window closed and the ship moved into the bandwidth-suppressed transit corridor, Marcus watched Subdirector Venn, the shorter Drev who ran the Bureau team's field division component, compact and very still in the way of field operatives who have learned to economize motion, make a small adjustment to his position near the secondary manifest office. Not threatening, not overtly anything. The kind of adjustment a person makes when a constraint disappears and they are recalibrating what's now available to them. Marcus went and found Vasquez before the dinner rotation. Dead zone, he said. How long? 40 hours minimum, she said. Possibly 50. The gradient in this corridor is deep. What does the Bureau's field division have operational latitude to do in a communications blackout? Vasquez looked at him steadily. Under emergency heritage preservation protocols, if they can argue the case for imminent risk of material loss from the bearer, full operational latitude. She paused. Sarge, what are you planning? He thought about what he was planning, and whether calling it a plan was accurate, or whether it was still just a direction. Not sure yet, he said. Keep your kit accessible. She looked at him for one more moment with the look of someone reading not what you're saying, but what's underneath it. And then she said, all right. And that was the end of it, that night. The dream came back longer. He was in the red place again. And this time he could walk through it, tall structures that were not quite trees, the red quality of the light belonging to the things themselves rather than to any external illumination, warm in a way that reached past the skin into something more interior. The sound was there, low and continuous, and now he could feel it vibrating in his sternum as clearly as he could feel his own heartbeat vibrating alongside his heartbeat, matching it. Or perhaps his heartbeat was matching it. The direction unclear, he walked, and he knew things he should not have known. The name of the plant in Vial, which was something he felt rather than heard, a word that was also a sensation. The specific quality of the light in the third hour after dawn. The way the sound changed when the warm wind came, layered into harmonics that built on each other, the way complex music builds. Each layer adding meaning rather than volume. He woke at 0230 with his heart rate elevated, and the warmth in his chest so precise and distinct that he put his own palm over it, pressing his hand against his sternum, the way Yael pressed hers, and felt something there. Not pain, not quite warmth, but a resonance, small and continuous and alive. A frequency that existed right below the threshold of ordinary perception, but right above the threshold of what the body could politely ignore. Yael was asleep beside him, breathing slowly, her hand in its usual position. Her shivering had stopped weeks ago. He was keeping her warm, and she had settled into that warmth with the absolute confidence of something that has found the exact thing it needs. He moved his own hand away from his chest. He did not sleep again for a long time. In the morning, he went to the medical bay during the unoccupied hour before first formation and asked the duty AI for a standard bioelectric baseline scan, which was within his rights as a service member. The scan came back normal across all 42 parameters that the standard military bioelectric assessment measured. He looked at the results for several minutes. He thought about how many parameters might exist that a standard military bioelectric assessment wasn't designed to measure. He folded the results. He went to formation. He said nothing about the scan to anyone. He told Yael about the dreams that evening, in the observation deck, where they had come by unspoken mutual agreement to have the conversations that needed saying. He told her about the red forest. He told her about the sound. He told her about the warmth in his sternum that had woken him up, and about pressing his own hand there and finding something. She listened without interruption. She looked at the stars. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. I should have warned you, she said. The weight of those words. He let them settle. What are you warning me about now? He said. She looked at the stars for another moment, and then at him. What I carry cannot exist in a medium that is dying, she said. It requires a living host. Our encoding process is not a transfer. A transfer implies that the information leaves one place and arrives in another. What my people developed works differently. You have a word for what happens when two objects vibrate at the same frequency, and one causes the other to begin vibrating without direct contact. Sympathetic resonance. I know what resonance is, Marcus said. Then you understand that it is not a movement. The information does not travel. It begins to exist in both places simultaneously, because both places are expressing the same fundamental frequency. She looked at him, with the full weight of what she was about to say visible in her eyes, before she said it. Human bioelectricity operates at a base frequency that is uniquely compatible with Veil covenant encoding. We have known this for a long time. Centuries. It is documented in the covenant itself. A pause. The encoding process that happened when I pressed my hand to your chest, it was not something I chose to initiate. My body recognized compatible resonance and responded to it the way a bearing responds to a magnet, or the way a stringed instrument responds to its own frequency when it is played in the same room. I am sorry. I should have explained before it began. And now, Marcus said, now a significant portion of the covenant exists in both of us, she said. It cannot be separated from you by any process that leaves you intact. He sat with that. The Bureau, he said, when they come for you. If they extract the encoding from my nervous system, she said, the extraction process destroys the substrate. The covenant material is not preserved. It is ended. That is the intention. She looked at the stars, the previous bearers, the closed files, all of them, Marcus said. All of them, she said. He looked at the viewport for a long moment. The dead zone pressed against the hull in silence. 40 hours of isolation in which the normal constraints had quietly shifted. There's a High Council session, he said. Arroyo Hub, 48 hours. If the Covenant gets formally presented there, it becomes protected testimony under the Council's founding charter, she said. The Bureau cannot touch it, or the bearer, once the testimony is on record. She looked at him. That is where I have been trying to go. That is why CAST sent the compressed signal at waypoint Sigma 7. They knew they were losing time. 40 hours of dead zone, Marcus said. Then communications back. Then we're on approach to Jericho Station and their facility. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Tell me what we need, he said. She looked at him for a moment, the specific look of someone who has been alone for a very long time and is deciding whether to stop being alone. A route to Arroyo Hub that doesn't go through Jericho, she said, and for you to still be willing when we get there. The transmission requires both of us in the council chamber. It requires the encoding in you to be accessible. She paused. And accessibility requires something from you that I cannot give you and cannot force. It requires you to actually feel what you're carrying. Not know it, feel it. The stars moved past the viewport. I'll work on that, Marcus said. She almost smiled. It was the nearest thing to a smile he'd seen on her face in 3 weeks of sharing a compartment, and it lasted exactly long enough for him to notice it before it was gone. They came at 0100, not CAST. Not the pale gray of the administrative division. The field division came, 4 of them in the darker operational charcoal, moving through the crew section with the coordinated silence of people who have executed variations of this operation before and have learned that speed before alarm is the primary technical requirement for its success. Marcus knew they were coming, approximately 90 seconds before they arrived. He knew because he had spent 40 hours watching Ven, and Ven competent, efficient. Careful had, nonetheless developed a pattern in how he moved through the ship, a circuit of the crew section at roughly 18-hour intervals, stopping at each junction point for almost exactly 40 seconds. Marcus had timed it 3 times. It had been consistent to within a margin that told him the consistency wasn't accidental, but trained. At 0111 that night, Ven's circuit did not happen. The absence of a predictable pattern, where a predictable pattern had been established, was, to Marcus, a very specific kind of information. He was awake and dressed, and had his sidearm at his hip, when the sound of 4 sets of boots moving in coordinated silence reached the compartment corridor at 0114. He put his hand on Yael's shoulder. She was upright before the motion completed, which told him she hadn't been fully asleep either. Seconds, he said. Maintenance access. Back wall. Left when you're in. Forward to junction 7. Wait there. She looked at him for exactly 1 second. Measuring something. Go, he said. She went. The 4 field officers came through the compartment door fast, and Marcus Marsus was ready for them, which made a material difference in how the next 90 seconds unfolded. The difference between 4 to 1 and 4 to 1, who knows? The terrain and is already moving was, in his experience, the kind of difference that mattered. It was not clean. Clean fights were fiction. What it was sufficient, which meant he was standing at the end of it, and the 4 officers were not. One had a collarbone that would require medical attention and would produce a report that was going to sound implausible. Another had a concussion that would make the next 48 hours deeply unpleasant. The other 2 had sustained injuries in the category of inconvenient rather than serious. Marcus had 2 cracked ribs from the 3rd officer, a laceration along his left forearm from a containment instrument deployed in a way that exceeded its rated application, and a burn mark along the right side of his neck where a non-lethal deterrent had made contact at shorter than its designed deployment distance. He was standing and moving, which was all the assessment mattered right now. Vasquez materialized from the secondary cross passage at Junction 3, already in full kit, without being called and without asking questions. 4 down in 12, he said. Then, she said, don't know his position, cast. Also unknown. Junction 7. She fell in beside him, and they moved forward through the maintenance corridor. And she did not ask him what they were doing, because she had already decided what she was doing, which was the same thing he was. Yale was at Junction 7, pressed against the conduit wall, with her hands still at her sides, and her eyes tracking both directions of the corridor in the systematic way of someone for whom assessing exits had become as automatic as breathing. When Marcus came around the corner, she let out a breath that was barely audible and entirely real. You are injured, she said, looking at the arm and the neck. Functional, he said. We have a limited window before the ship's internal security is notified and responds. We need to get to the captain. She needs to know everything before she makes decision, and she needs to make it before Cast and Ven regroup. The captain, Yale said. You think she'll help? I think she looked at an incident report this morning that included 2 of her crew members being assessed for injuries from Bureau Field Division operational tools, Marcus said, and she's been chewing on it for 8 hours. I think if I give her the full picture and a clear option, she'll make the right call. Yale looked at him. All right, she said. The captain. They moved. Ven found them at the cross-junction 2 corridors from the bridge access. He came from the forward angle, which was the cut Marcus would have taken in his position, and he moved with the specific economy of a field operative who has trained for exactly this kind of recovery scenario. He had his containment field emitter up, and he used it before Marcus closed the distance, and the emitter worked as designed. Yale went down. There was no violence in it, which was the unsettling part. No impact, no sound. Just the bioelectric disruption of the vagal nervous system hitting the specific frequency that interrupted its function, and she folded quietly to the deck. Still conscious, eyes still open, but unable to coordinate movement. Marcus had been in motion when the emitter fired, and physics carried him the rest of the distance. What followed was brief and resolved in his favor, though not without cost. He had a new bruise developing across his left ribs on top of the existing cracked ones, and Ven had the emitter skittering across the deck, and Marcus's forearm pinning him against the conduit with the specific pressure of someone who is not interested in negotiation. Call off the operation, Marcus said. This is authorized heritage retrieval under the Heritage Preservation Ordinance. Ven said, in the clipped tone of a man who knows his legal footing and is calculating whether it's sufficient. You are obstructing Bureau field operations. That carries serious legal consequences. Call off the operation, Marcus said again. He did not modify his tone. He didn't need to. The second field officer had come around from the cross passage and had his emitter up, and his angle on Marcus was good. But his angle on Marcus from behind Yale was good. And Marcus had positioned himself that way deliberately, and the officer did the math and didn't fire. You have no legal authority here, Ven said. None. I have a sergeant's authority over the welfare of coalition-registered passengers aboard a coalition vessel, Marcus said. And I have a captain who is going to want a very detailed explanation for why her ship's maintenance corridor is currently occupied by this conversation. Your call on how you want that explanation to go. Ven ran the math. It was the same math Marcus had seen Cast and the corridor officer run, and it came out to the same answer. The cost of forcing this exceeded the cost of waiting. Ven stopped moving. Marcus got to Yale. She was sitting up when he reached her, braced against the conduit, and her hands were shaking in the fine, continuous way of a nervous system that had been disrupted and was working to re-establish its own signal. Her eyes found him immediately, and in them was the aftermath of fear. Not the fear itself, but the moment after the thing that almost happened shows you the precise shape of what you almost lost. She pressed her hand against his chest. Not the careful listening placement of the nighttime contact both hands, this time. Deliberate and complete. Pressed flat against his sternum, with a urgency that had nothing measured about it. He felt the warmth move through him instantly. Deeper than warmth. Reaching something he still didn't have accurate language for. And then everything opened. That was the word he would come back to in the moment and in every reconstruction he would ever attempt. Opened. Not in him, or not only in him, in both of them, the way a resonant cavity opens when the right frequency enters it. And through the opening came 236,000 lives at once. Not as information, not as language, as presence, as the full, accumulated weight of a people. Their color and their music and their arguments and their grief and their love and their dying. The texture of what it had meant to be Vale across their entire recorded history. All of it settling into him the way a river settles into the bed that was shaped for it. And the warmth was not warmth anymore, but something vast and specific and completely real. Something he did not have a category for, and did not need one. He understood what he was carrying. He had been carrying it for weeks. He had been carrying it since the first night she pressed her hand against his sternum in the dark of compartment 14, and said the resonance is also correct. He had been carrying it without knowing, and now he knew. And the knowledge did not feel like an intrusion. It felt like finally reading the label on a weight you've been holding long enough to have adapted to it. All of them, he said. It was barely a sound. All of them, Yale said. Her voice was steadier than he would have expected. Her eyes were very bright. Captain Okonkwo listened to Marcus's full account without interrupting, which was her method-complete intake. Then response. No wasted motion. She looked at his forearm and the burn, and she looked at Yael, still slightly unsteady from the emitter disruption. She looked at the injury log her first officer had been compiling in real time as situation reports came in from the ship's security team. When Marcus finished, she was quiet for a moment. "What you're telling me," she said, "is that a Bureau field team conducted an unauthorized operation against a registered passenger under my jurisdiction without notifying me, without notifying you, and without any emergency authorization that I was shown," Marcus said, "and that this passenger is the last surviving member of her species and is carrying the entirety of her people's cultural and genetic record." "Yes," Yale said. Okonkwo looked at her for a moment then. "The High Council session at Arroyo Hub. How long does the testimony window stay open once a formal emergency witness petition is filed?" Yael looked at her with a new quality of attention. "The filing triggers a 48-hour hold on the relevant session agenda item. Once the petition is filed, I have 48 hours to appear in person and transmit. We have a communications dead zone for the next 36 hours, Okonkwo said. After that, we're on approach to Jericho Station, which is where the Bureau's extraction facility is located. She said this without editorial, as a simple arrangement of facts. Arroyo Hub is 6 hours past Jericho on our current heading. Yes, Marcus said. Okonkwo looked at them both for a long moment. I have the authority, she said, as captain of this vessel, to file a welfare and safety deviation and alter our route in response to documented crew and passenger welfare concerns. I also have the authority to restrict Bureau Field Division operational access aboard my ship on crew safety grounds, which I am doing now. Effective immediately. Pending formal review. She straightened. I also have the formal incident documentation of an unauthorized field operation against a registered passenger under my care, which I am attaching to a route deviation filing that cites passenger welfare as its basis. That filing will trigger review of your command decisions, Marcus said. Yes, she said, and I have 12 years of documentation on my side, plus an injury log that is going to be very difficult to explain away. She looked at him steadily. I've read your service record, Staff Sergeant, Kerrigan Station. I know what kind of decision put that notation there. And I know what kind of decision you're trying not to make twice. She moved to the navigation console. Go get some rest. We'll be at Arroyo Hub in approximately 30 hours. That night, for the first time, Yale did not press her hand to his chest when she slept. He noticed the absence before he understood it. She slept against his side as she always had, cold, finding warmth, the natural arrangement that had developed between them. But her hand rested on the bunk surface rather than on his sternum. He understood. The transfer was complete. There was nothing more to do. What she had been doing for weeks consciously in the end, he knew now, deliberately and with intention, was done. He was carrying what she had needed him to carry. She was resting. He lay awake with the full understanding of that, with the complete, unhidden reality of what was warm and alive in his chest. 236,000 people who had loved their Red Forest world, and their low music and their accumulated centuries of living. A people who had trusted one survivor to find the one species in the galaxy whose nervous system was built, by mathematics he didn't fully understand and didn't need to be a compatible home. He thought about 3 names from Kerrigan Station. Recited in the order their tags had come to him. He thought about Yale's voice the first night. That sound that was not quite a sigh and not quite a note of relief, but somewhere between, exhausted and alone and briefly, unexpectedly, not outside, the dead zone pressed against the hull. Inside, he lay with a warmth in his chest that was 236,000 lives, quiet and present, vibrating at the exact frequency of something that had been waiting for him without knowing he existed. He was all right with that. He realized, with a specific surprise that had his own particular shape, more than all right with it. Director Orvith arrived at Waypoint Kessler 4, which was one day from Jericho Station. He came on a Bureau Executive Transport, a narrow, fast vessel in administrative white, the class built for senior officials who need to move between sensitive jurisdictions quickly without the trappings of an official state visit. The transport docked with the Meridian without prior communication to the ship's command, which was within the senior directorate's authority under active operational conditions, and Captain Okonkwo accepted the docking with the professional composure of a person who had already filed her deviation paperwork and was prepared for exactly this kind of escalation. Marcus was in the cargo bay on the captain's instruction when Orvith came aboard. He'd studied the director's bureau profile 3 days ago, when Vasquez had first named the GRB's specific involvement in VAL classification, and the profile matched the physical reality closely. Tall, even for a Drev, with an economy of movement that suggested someone who had learned a long time ago that every unnecessary action was a form of waste. His eyes were the color of a sky that had been thoroughly drained of weather, not cold, not warm, but categorically, without the particular property that makes eyes appear interested in the object they're observing. Orvith did not look at Marcus when he came through the cargo bay. He looked through it in the way that a very precise instrument looks through the medium it's aimed at toward the thing it's measuring. He was there for Yael. Everything else was intermediate. Captain Okonkwo arranged the meeting in the ship's small conference room, with herself and her first officer and Marcus present alongside Orvith and the single aide who accompanied him. Yael sat at the table's end with her hands in her lap and the specific quality of stillness she wore when stillness was a tool. Orvith opened with law, not threat, which was the more effective position and the one he clearly preferred. He moved through it with the precision of someone who had spent 40 years building an institution on documentation and had the documentation to show for it. He outlined the Bureau's jurisdiction over Vale Covenant material under the Heritage Preservation Ordinance. He described the timeline of Yale's classification as the last known bearer. He noted, with the particular specificity of someone who understands that detail is more intimidating than volume, that the 3 previous bearers had been successfully processed through the extraction protocol at Jericho Station, and that the extracted material had been appropriately archived under Bureau Classification Level 7. Archived. Marcus noted that word. He held it. This extraction, Captain Okonkwo said, when Orvith reached the Jericho component. What does it involve for the bearer? The neural encoding is extracted from the bearer's cognitive substrate and transferred to Bureau Standard Archival Medium, Orvith said, where it is maintained against deterioration or loss. The bearer survives the procedure, Okonkwo said. The pause was very small. A person not listening for it would not have registered it. The extraction is a medically supervised process, Orvith said. That's not what I asked, Okonkwo said. Orvith looked at her with the expression of a person who has been asked a question he considers beneath the appropriate level of discussion. The cognitive substrate experiences disruption during the extraction process to a degree that is incompatible with continued neurological function, he said. The bearer does not survive the procedure. The covenant encoding is preserved in archival form. The conference room was quiet for a moment. She dies, Marcus said. The Bazaire's biological function ceases as a consequence of the extraction, Orvith said. The covenant material is preserved. You kill her, Marcus said, and you call it preservation. The alternative, Orvith said, with the patience of someone explaining a self-evident position to people he considers categorically less rational than himself, is that the covenant encoding continues to exist in an uncontrolled living medium that cannot be secured, that can be presented before political bodies, in contexts the Bureau has not authorized, and that contains historical material whose unrestricted disclosure would generate significant instability in the current galactic political framework. He set his hands flat on the table. 236,000 Vale lives were lost. That loss is documented and filed. What the covenant encoding contains is a detailed account of decisions made by founding members of the current council, decisions made 400 years ago, under conditions that no longer apply, that would, if presented in open session, be used to argue for the dissolution of treaties that have maintained galactic peace for those 400 years. I am asking you to do the mathematics. The mathematics, Marcus said, starts with 236,000 people. Weighted against 400 years of stability, Orvith said, and the projected cost in lives if that stability fractures. Weighted by you? Marcus said. Decided by you. On behalf of an institution that benefits from the current framework staying exactly as it is. By the Bureau. Orvith said, which is the appropriate authority for heritage classification decisions. The phrase settled into the room with the particular quality of a statement that has been rehearsed enough times to stop meaning anything to the person saying it while meaning everything to the people hearing it. Captain Okonkwo said, Director, I have a formal incident report for an unauthorized field operation conducted aboard my vessel against a registered passenger without my knowledge, authorization, or any emergency justification I was shown. The operation was conducted under established Bureau emergency protocols, Orvith said, against a registered passenger on a coalition military vessel. Okonkwo said, I would like the specific legal citation for the clause that authorizes that action aboard a ship under my command. Orvith looked at her. He looked at Marcus. He looked, finally, at Yale, who had not said a single word since the meeting began. There is a practical resolution available, he said. Transfer of the bearer to Bureau custody. Voluntary cooperation with the extraction protocol at Jericho Station. In exchange, I will ensure that no formal charges are filed against Captain Okonkwo, Corporal Vasquez, or Staff Sergeant Webb for obstruction of Bureau operations which, I want to be clear, currently applies to all three. Silence. No, Yale said, the first word she had spoken in the room. Orvith looked at her. The covenant is not yours, she said, in exactly the tone she had used to tell Marcus that the top bunk was his precise, entirely certain, without performance. It has never been yours, it belongs to my people, and my people trusted it to me to hold until it could be heard by a body, with the authority and the charter mandate, to hear it, not a bureau, the High Council. She looked at him with the full stillness of someone who has accepted all the possible consequences of a position and chosen it anyway. You will not hear it. But the council will. Something moved through Orvith's expression then. Not emotion, exactly. The Drev were too disciplined for that. But a recalibration, the adjustment of a very precise instrument encountering a variable it had underweighted. The council session, he said, very evenly, is in 48 hours. You are currently 1 day from Jericho Station, which is 6 hours from Arroyo Hub. The mathematics remain what they are. He was right. The mathematics were not in their favor. Yet, the scan took place before Orvith left the conference room, and it was the scan that changed everything. He used a portable resonance scanner, a pre-extraction assessment tool, standard bureau equipment, designed to map the surface frequencies of a neural encoding without direct contact. A preliminary step, routine for any extraction protocol, used to establish the scope and complexity of what the full extraction would need to address. He ran it over Yael with the efficient professionalism of someone performing a procedure he has performed many times, and the scanner showed him its results. Marcus watched Orvith, read the results. He watched him, read them twice. He watched the director's expression controlled, precise, constructed over decades into a thing that did not show anything. It was not authorized to do something around the eyes that was not quite a response and not quite not a response. Something very small and very fast. The kind of thing that is only visible to people who have learned to watch the eyes of people who are trying not to be readable. Orvith looked up from the scanner. He looked at Yael. "Where is it?" he said. "Safe," she said. He looked at the scanner again. He looked at Marcus, and Marcus felt Orvith's gaze move across him with the specific quality of someone who has just been required to revise a calculation they considered complete. The director's eyes were on him for perhaps 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds Marcus knew that Orvith had run the new math and was not finished with it yet. "Interesting," Orvith said, quietly. To no one in particular. He closed the scanner. He stood. He told Captain Okonkwo he would need additional time to address the legal framework of the situation, and would be in contact within 6 hours. He left without looking at Marcus again. They were in the corridor outside the conference room. Vasquez materializing from the auxiliary passage, with the expression of someone who has been listening around a corner and is waiting for the briefing, when Marcus said to Yael, "He knows." "Yes," she said. The scanner showed him where the encoding wasn't, and then he looked at me. "Yes," she said. Her hands were not entirely steady, and she was not trying to hide it. "He knows what I'm carrying," Marcus said. "He's doing the math on what it costs him to deal with that." "Yes," she said again. "What does the math tell him?" Vasquez said. Yael looked at her. She looked at Marcus. "If he attempts the extraction on you," she said, "he kills a coalition military officer in active service. That restarts the ceasefire conflict, 11 years of negotiated peace. Undone by one death." She said it clearly as a fact. "He is not prepared to pay that cost. The Bureau's power depends on galactic stability. Destabilizing it to solve this problem would cost him more than the problem costs him. So he can't kill me," Marcus said. "No," she said. "But he also can't let us reach the High Council," Marcus said, thinking through it. "Because if the Covenant gets presented in that chamber, it's protected testimony under the Charter, and everything the Bureau has been hiding for 4 centuries becomes part of the public record." "Yes," she said. "So he can't use force against me," Marcus said, "and he can't let me through. Which means he will use documentation." Yael said. He has spent 40 years building an institution that controls the galaxy's records. He will build a record that prevents you from testifying. She looked at Marcus with the full weight of what she was saying. He has 6 hours before communications return. He is very good at this. Marcus leaned against the corridor wall. He looked at the industrial ceiling of the Meridian, at the familiar geography of the ship that had become, in 4 weeks, something more than transit. He thought about 6 hours. He thought about 40 hours to Arroyo Hub. He thought about the warmth in his chest that was 236,000 lives. Quiet and present and impossible to give back. "What does the transmission require?" he said. "If we get to the chamber, what exactly has to happen?" Yale looked at him. Something in her expression was very careful. "I initiate the transmission protocol," she said. "The encoding activates through me and moves through you, not to you. The primary copy is already in you, through you, to the Council's resonance listener. But the activation requires the encoding in you to be fully accessible." She paused, not carried passively, accessed, felt. He heard what she was saying. "You told me before," he said. "Feel it, not just know it." "Yes," she said, "and I told you I didn't know if I could do that." "Yes," she said. "I still don't know," he said. "I know," she said, "but you will have to try." She looked at him with something in her eyes that was not the practical assessment she normally gave him, but something more direct and more difficult. The expression of someone who has examined a person closely enough to know both what they're capable of and what it will cost them. "You let it matter, Marcus." 3 weeks ago, on the observation deck. "When you let what I told you about my people actually land inside you, that was when the encoding accelerated. Not because you were kind, though you were, because you opened to it." She paused. "You have been carrying it ever since. All you need to do is stop carrying it at arm's length." He said nothing for a moment. He thought about the warmth in his chest, He thought about the red forest and the music that was too low for ears but exactly the right frequency for everything else. He thought about what it was going to cost to let that fully in, what it was going to require of him. The specific thing he had spent 2 years working to close against. He pushed off the wall. "Vasquez," he said. "Already thinking," she said. "Think about what we need to get from the civilian berth to the council chamber without going through the main concourse." She was quiet for a moment then. "Give me 4 hours." "You have 3, he said. She gave him the look of someone who has accepted an unreasonable deadline because the alternative is worse, and went. There was also what the Covenant said about him. He sat with Yael on the observation deck for the last time that evening, and she told him what was in the 43rd record of the Covenant's 2nd volume. She told it carefully, translating from a language that did not fully translate, taking the time each phrase required. 380 years ago, when humanity was barely extrasolar, when the first human survey vessels were cautiously feeling their way through the outer protocols of early galactic contacta, Vale Explorer encountered a human crew near what later became known as the Helion boundary. They spent 11 days in mutual proximity, attempting communication through translator technology that was insufficient for the task. They understood very little of what the other was saying, but the Vale Explorer, who was a bearer, noticed something that gem. In the proximity of the human crew, her encoding resonance activated in a way it had never activated before. Her body was doing what Yael's body had done, with Marcus recognizing compatible resonance and responding to it. Instinctively, the way a homing signal responds to its receiver frequency. She went back to her people. She reported. They studied it for years. What they found was this: human bioelectric architecture, specifically the pattern of frequencies generated by the connection between the human limbic system and the nervous system. The biological substrate of what humans called emotion was precisely compatible with Vale encoding frequencies. Not partly compatible, not theoretically compatible. Compatible in the way a key is compatible with the lock it was made for, perfectly and completely and in every relevant dimension. But Vale and humans didn't evolve together, Marcus said. We were on opposite ends of the galaxy. Yes, she said. The Covenant scientists spent 40 years studying it. The conclusion was that the compatibility was not evolutionary, but mathematical. The physics of living nervous systems operating at sufficient complexity, at sufficient emotional dimensionality, converge on a small set of base frequencies, regardless of the biology that produced them or the evolutionary pressures that shaped it. Your species arrived at those frequencies from a completely different direction than mine, across completely different history, through completely different experience. She looked at him. The researchers called it the convergence principle, the idea that consciousness itself, not human consciousness, not veil consciousness, but the fundamental property that both are expressions of tends toward the same frequencies. That what we built in our encoding technology was not a veil invention, but a reflection of something true about how minds work. The stars moved outside the viewport. So when you said the veil knew, Marcus said, when you said it was in the covenant itself, the 43rd record states, explicitly she said that when the day came that the veil needed their legacy preserved beyond the reach of those who would destroy it, they should seek a human, not any host, a human, because humans had arrived through their own particular path at exactly the frequency the covenant needed. She held his gaze. My body did not act on instinct without direction. The direction was in the covenant. My body followed it because I am the last bearer, and you were there, and you were the right frequency, and you were willing. He sat with that for a long time. He sat with the specific weight of being chosen by 380 years of hope, by a people who had not known him specifically, but had known that someone like him would exist. They planned this, he said. They hoped for it, she said, with care. Not the same thing. They could not have known you. They only knew that the frequency existed in your species, and that it was compatible, and that when one of their last bearers found a human who was willing to open to the resonance, it would work. She looked at him. You had every reason to close against it. Your history gave you every reason. I thought I had, he said. I know, she said. I felt the moment when you stopped. He looked at her. The observation deck, he said. The first time I asked what you were carrying. Yes, she said. You let it matter. That was enough. They sat together on the observation deck for a while longer, and neither of them said anything further. And the stars moved past the viewport at their ancient pace, and somewhere in his chest, 236,000 lives breathed quietly in the frequency that had been waiting for something like him. Arroyo Hub was a permanent orbital station at the convergence of three major galactic trade and diplomatic routes, and it showed. The architecture was 3 centuries of accumulated additions, each era adding its layer onto the one before, so that the station had the specific quality of a place that has been important for a long time and knows it. The council session facility occupied the hub's central ring, and its main concourse was the standard passage point for all session participants, formally required, well monitored, and the most obvious place in the station for a bureau director with 40 years of institutional leverage to arrange for a specific person not to pass through. Marcus stood at the civilian berth viewport and looked at the station and thought about the main concourse. Not through the front, he said. No, Vasquez said, beside him, with the tone of someone who has already done the research and is confirming a conclusion. She pulled up the facility schematics on her tablet, publicly accessible, cross-referenced with maintenance documentation she'd obtained from a registry subdirectory that was technically public record and practically invisible without knowing exactly where to look. She had known where to look. Service conduit from civilian berth level 3 connects to the station's utility maintenance network. The network has access points at 6 locations inside the council facility, including the pre-session holding corridor on level 4. That corridor connects directly to the chamber's secondary entrance. Session prep crew uses the pre-session corridor until 90 minutes before opening, Marcus said. Until 90 minutes before, Vasquez confirmed. After that, it's restricted. Before that, it's technically accessible to authorized facility staff. We're not authorized facility staff. We're also not using the door they're watching, Vasquez said. Marcus looked at her for a moment. He thought about what was waiting for them on the main concourse Orvith's 6 hours of documentation work. The Bureau's considerable authority at a station this politically significant, possibly coalition security involvement given the formal investigation complaint. He thought about the alternative. The emergency witness petition, he said. Can it be filed remotely, before we get to the chamber? Already filed, Vasquez said. He looked at her. I filed it 3 hours ago from the Meridian's communications terminal, the minute we came out of the dead zone. It's in the Council's charter compliance queue. The 48-hour protection window started 3 hours ago. He looked at her for another moment. Vasquez, he said. You would have thought of it, she said, entirely without generosity. He almost said something. He didn't. Some things between people who know each other well don't need to be said in order to be said. Main concourse, she said. I'll be there being very loudly wrong about where you are. How long do you need? He looked at Yael, who was standing slightly behind him, listening. How long does the transmission take? He said. 6 minutes and 40 seconds, she said, if the initiation goes cleanly. 7 minutes, Marcus told Vasquez, plus getting to the chamber. 90 minutes before the session opens, she said. Go, she went. He did not watch her go, because watching her go was not something he was prepared to do in front of witnesses. The service conduit was cold and narrow, and smelled of insulation and recycled air, and Yael moved through it more easily than Marcus did, because she was small and because she had spent 26 months developing a working relationship with secondary exits. They didn't talk. He could hear his own heartbeat clearly in the confined space, and beneath it present and steady as it always was now. The resonance, the warmth, 236,000 lives, breathing alongside him. He thought about what Yael had said. Stop carrying it at arm's length. He thought about the red forest and the music he could feel, but couldn't quite hear with ears. He thought about what it would cost to hear it fully. He kept moving. The pre-session holding corridor was exactly where the schematics said it would be. Accessible from the 4th maintenance access point. Passable during the prep crew window. They've made it with 14 minutes to spare before the window closed. They were 7 minutes into those 14 when Director Orvith stepped out of the cross passage at the corridor's far end. He was already in position, which meant he had anticipated the secondary route, which meant his intelligence on the hub's facility infrastructure was better than Marcus had allowed for and worse than he needed it to be. Orvith had 2 field officers with him. One of them was Venn, who had a containment emitter at his side, and the expression of a man who was not surprised to be here and not interested in making anything of it. Orvith looked at both of them with the even composure of someone who has rehearsed the probable trajectories of a situation and is prepared for the one he's standing in. Staff Sergeant Webb, he said, you are currently under formal coalition investigation and bureau complaint. You are also in an unauthorized access area of the Arroyo Hub High Council facility. He said it without heat or emphasis. The way a person states conditions that are simply true. I am exercising my authority to detain you pending transfer to coalition custody. The session opens Marcus started. In 13 minutes, Orvith said, yes. And you will not be in it. He looked at Yael. Bearer, he said, and the word had in it the specific coldness of someone who has classified a person as a file designation for long enough that the classification has settled into their vocabulary as default. The situation remains what it has always been. Transfer to bureau custody, cooperation with the extraction protocol, and no further action against your associates. Your people's covenant will be preserved in bureau archival storage. Accessible to authorized researchers. Authorized by the Bureau, Yael said. By the Bureau. Orvith said, which authorized its own destruction, she said, which classified its own crimes, which decided for 400 years what was appropriate for the rest of the galaxy to know about how those 400 years began. She looked at him with a clarity that had the weight of the entire covenant behind it. You have never been the appropriate authority for this. You only had the ability to act as if you were, and no one who survived was left to say otherwise. Until now, Marcus said. Orvith looked at him. He looked at Marcus the way he had looked at the resonance scanner results in the conference room, with the specific attention of a very precise instrument that has encountered a variable it needs to fully account for. Staff Sergeant, he said, I have filed formal documentation with the Coalition Inspector General, the Bureau's legal directorate, and this facility's security office stating that you are in possession of classified heritage material obtained without authorization, that your involvement with passenger 4417 Yale constitutes an unauthorized contact with a classified Bureau asset, and that your actions throughout this transit constitute obstruction of Bureau field operations. He said this carefully, making sure each element landed. No investigative body in the coalition will accept testimony from a subject under that level of formal complaint without first completing the investigation. You have no standing to petition this council. Article 12 of the Council's founding charter, Marcus said, emergency witness status for a coalition citizen presenting material evidence relevant to a matter under the Council's direct charter authority. Filed by Corporal Elena Vasquez, UNS Meridian. 3 hours ago. Orvith was quiet for a fraction of a second. Article 12, he said, has not been invoked in 240 years. It only needs to work once, Marcus said. Orvith looked at him for one more moment. Then he nodded, very slightly, to Ven. The emitter hit Marcus in the chest. He went down. 40 seconds. That was how long his nervous system took to re-establish function after the disruption 40 seconds in which he was on the deck. Conscious, unable to coordinate movement, and acutely aware that Yale was still standing, and that Orvith was moving toward her, and that Ven had stepped between them, with the specific economy of a field operative who does not waste motion. The second field officer had come around from the cross passage to cut the angle. Yale had not moved. She stood exactly where she had been standing, with her hands at her sides and her eyes on Orvith. And in the quality of her stillness there was something that was not exactly defiance and not exactly calm, but was the specific state of a person who has accepted what is coming and has decided how to meet it. Don't, Marcus said, from the deck. Still not fully coordinated. Still working on it. Orvith reached for her. What happened next happened in the 3 seconds between Marcus's nervous system reaching 80% function and Vasquez coming around the corridor corner from the main concourse direction. She was not, it turned out, on the main concourse, being loudly wrong about where they were. She had been briefly on the main concourse and had then stopped being on it, because she had apparently assessed the tactical situation and determined that the main concourse was not where she was needed. She came around the corner with the particular efficiency of someone who has been doing this for 12 years, hit Ven from his uncovered angle, and Ven went down. The second field officer did the math 2 against 1, both with combat experience, both with motivation, terrain knowledge, and nothing left to lose, and stood down. Orvith was still reaching for Yael when he registered what had changed in the corridor. He straightened. He looked at Vasquez. He looked at Ven on the floor. He looked at Marcus, who was on his feet now, and at Yael, who had not moved, and at the corridor, which had become substantially less favorable to his position than it had been 4 seconds ago. The calculation he ran was visible in the brief pause before he spoke. This does not change the legal framework, he said. Come to the session and say so, Marcus said. In the chamber, on the record, in front of the council, or don't. Either way. He looked at Orvith for one more moment, at the man who had spent 40 years maintaining a system that had decided 236,000 people were a reasonable cost for institutional stability, who had done it with genuine conviction, who had genuinely believed the math, who had a blind spot the size of everything that made the math wrong. He turned and walked the last 2 corridors to the High Council chamber, with Yael beside him and Vasquez behind them, and he did not look back. They were inside with 6 minutes to spare. The chamber was older than its current use, with the kind of architectural weight that accumulates over centuries of decisions. The light came from sources chosen to be equitable across species. Not warm exactly, not cool, but present. The listener's station was a dedicated resonance receiving position built into the chamber's design, which meant the council had received veiled testimony before. 300 years of a station designed to hear her people's voice, and, for the last 4 years, no voice to receive. Yale stood in the center of the chamber. Marcus stood beside her. She looked at him, with the full weight of everything that had happened between the service conduit and this room in her eyes. The emergency petition filing will trigger the session to open to our testimony first, she said. Before any other business, we have the window. 6 minutes and 40 seconds, he said. If the initiation goes cleanly, she said, which requires. I know what it requires, he said. She looked at him. Then she reached out and pressed both hands flat against his chest. Not the careful nighttime placement, but something more complete, palms open. Covering the position she had returned to every night for 3 weeks. The position she had found the first night and recognized as correct. Marcus, she said, tell me something true. He looked at her. He understood what she was asking. Not for information, not for reassurance. She was asking him to open the thing he had been carrying at arm's length. She was asking him to stop managing the distance. He looked at her hands on his chest, and he thought about what was under them. All of it, the full weight. The red forest, and the music, and 236,000 names recorded in a census that was the last count of a people, and the 26 months of a loan that came after. And Yael, pressing her face into his chest in the dark, because his body ran at the right frequency, and her people had always known that something like him would exist, and she had found him in a too small bunk on an overcrowded transport. Because that was the particular geography of how these things happened. He thought about Kerrigan Station, and 3 names in order. He thought about the sound she had made the first night, not quite a sigh, and not quite a note of relief. Something between those things. Carrying in it the specific exhaustion of a person who has been enduring something alone for a very long time, and has been for one moment not alone. He thought about what it meant to let something matter completely, what it actually cost, what it gave back. He felt it, all of it, not the knowledge of it. He had known it for weeks, the full weight of it, unhidden, unmanaged, allowed to be exactly what it was. 236,000 lives, their completeness and their specificity and their absence. The unbearable reality of what had been done to them, and the equal, unbearable reality of what they had left behind, in the hope that someone would still be listening. He was crying. He registered it the way you register rain when you've been inside long enough to forget it's possible. Not surprised, only surprised that you'd thought you'd lost access to this. It had been 2 years since anything had required it of him. He had believed he'd closed it off. He had been wrong, apparently, by enough that it mattered. Yale's hands were warm against his chest. The warmth moved through him like a frequency arriving at its room. Good, she said, quietly. That's exactly it. She closed her eyes. The transmission began. The council's listener, a Valori, species adapted for multi-frequency emotional broadcast reception, appointed to the listener's station 3 months prior, received the covenant. Marcus could not describe it from the outside, because he was not outside it. He was the medium. And in the medium, the transmission was the fullest thing he had experienced in 37 years of being a person who experienced things. It was not overwhelming. It was not painful. It was not like the things he had braced himself for. It was an opening, the word he kept returning to, had returned to since the maintenance corridor, the only accurate word he had. The river finding the bed that was shaped for it. 236,000 lives, their fullness, and their individual texture, flowing through the electrical architecture of a human man who had spent 2 years working at not letting things matter, and who had turned out at the specific moment it was necessary to still know how. It lasted 6 minutes and 40 seconds. The transmission was complete. The warmth in his chest did not diminish. it would not diminish. He would carry the Covenant for the rest of his life dormant, without a bearer to initiate the transmission protocol. But present, the frequency established, the warmth specific and real, the occasional red forest dream, the music below the threshold of hearing, the knowledge he could not access as knowledge, but could not unfeel. He would carry it the way a river carries what it has run over, not as an object, as a quality of the flow. He looked at Yael. She was looking at him. "Is it enough?" he said. "It is everything," she said. "Every record, every name." He nodded. The chamber doors opened. Orvith walked in alone. He walked in with the precise economy of a man who has reassessed the situation and has come to state the new parameters. He stood in the chamber floor and he looked at Marcus, and then at Yale, and then at the listener's station, where the Valori listener was completing the verification documentation for the transmission they had received. "The investigation against you is still active," he said to Marcus. "I know," Marcus said. "The legal framework has not changed because of what happened in this room." "Some of it has," Yale said. Orvith looked at the listener's station. He looked at the record that was now part of the Council's protected archive, time-stamped and verified under the Testimony Preservation Protocol, that the founding charter had established and that the Bureau had apparently never anticipated being invoked because it had been 240 years since anyone had tried. "The Covenant is on record," he said. "Yes," Yale said. Something moved through Orvith's expression, not defeat. A man who had spent 40 years building institutional power did not wear defeat on his face, and this was not defeat anyway. Not yet. Not in the simple sense. It was the specific recalibration of someone who has encountered a changed set of conditions and is processing the update with the thoroughness it requires. The Covenant was on record. The Bureau could challenge the filing. The investigation against Marcus could proceed. There would be legal mechanisms and counterclaims that would take years to fully resolve. And in those years, the record of what the Bureau had done to the Veil, what the founding Drev had done, and what Orvith's institution had done to maintain the silence would sit in the Council's archive with the protected status of verified testimony, available to every researcher and journalist and political advocate who knew to look for it. He could not undo it. "You will face consequences," he said to Marcus. "Yes," Marcus said. "Come back when they're ready." Orvith looked at him for one more moment, at the Coalition staff sergeant standing in the High Council chamber, carrying a dead species in his chest, who had made it here through a service conduit and a pre-session corridor, and everything that Orvith's 6 hours of documentation work had been designed to prevent. He turned and left the chamber. Marcus stood there for a moment, looking at where Orvith had been. "That was less dramatic than I expected," he said. "The most important things rarely are," Yale said. He looked at her. He almost laughed. "Didn't quite." "What happens now?" he said. "Now," she said, "there are consequences for everyone." She said it with her eyes open, in the way she said things she had already accepted. "For you most visibly. The investigation is real." "I know," he said. "You will probably lose something," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "Was it?" "Yes," he said, before she finished. He didn't need to hear the rest of the question. She looked at him for a moment longer, with those two large eyes that gathered light and gave it back. Then she nodded, once, with the specific nod of someone who has verified a thing they needed to verify. "All right," she said. From the corridor outside the chamber, they heard Vasquez say, at moderate volume and with a specificity that suggested she was talking to someone official. "I have no information about the current whereabouts of Staff Sergeant Webb, as I have said several times." Marcus walked out to the corridor to deal with the consequences. The aftermath was long and complicated, and did not resolve cleanly, because nothing real did. Captain Okonkwo's route deviation was reviewed and upheld as within operational discretion, with a notation she contested formally and had cleared a year and a half later. Her record came out cleaner than before, in the opinion of everyone who examined it, alongside what the Covenant testimonies subsequently revealed about what she had been transporting. Corporal Vasquez received a formal reprimand for her role in the Article 12 filing and her actions in the pre-session corridor. She appealed it on the grounds that everything she had done was within the applicable regulations, read at sufficient depth. After 7 months, the appeal was upheld and the reprimand expunged. "I told you," she said to Marcus when it came through. "You did," he said. Marcus's investigation took 9 months. The formal finding acknowledged unauthorized interference with Bureau field operations. It also acknowledged justified welfare intervention on behalf of a registered passenger. It also acknowledged that the Bureau's field operations had themselves been conducted without proper notification to the vessel's commanding officer, which was its own violation. The resolution was a written reprimand and a reduction from staff sergeant to sergeant, which Marcus did not contest. "You should appeal," Vasquez said. "No," he said. "You'd win," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not interested in winning it." She looked at him for a moment, and then away, which was the form her respect took when she disagreed with a decision. He was assigned to a desk rotation at Kerrigan Station while the investigation resolved, which was the coalition's way of keeping him proximate and busy. He spent 8 months there. The station was different than he remembered. Not because it had changed, but because he had. In the way that carrying something long enough changes the shape you move through the world with. The 3 names he recited in order were still there. They would always be there. But they sat alongside something larger now. And the weight was different when it was shared. Orvith was placed under counsel investigation within 4 months of the testimony filing, as the first researchers to access the Covenant record published their findings, and the political implications of the founding-era material became public. The Bureau's heritage classification practices were under formal review. Reform proceedings had been initiated in the Council's Oversight Committee. These were the kinds of things that moved slowly through institutions as old as the Council, with the friction that power generates when it is being examined. But they moved. The Vale species was reclassified from extinct to culturally preserved, which created a formal designation that the Covenant record would be maintained as a living archive rather than a closed file, and that Vale cultural and biological reconstruction was a recognized objective of the Council's charter. What that would mean in the long term was something only the long term could show. It was a beginning, which is what beginnings are, not the thing itself, but the opening toward it. Yael remained at Arroyo Hub through the initial proceedings as the formal witness of record for the Covenant testimony, and then transferred to the Vial Preservation Coordination Office, which was 4 people in a room that was too small for the work, and an administrative budget that was insufficient for it, and which was nonetheless the first official structure created specifically to do that work. Which was something. She sent him messages, once every few weeks. They were not long, they were precise in the way she was precise, and they said what they meant. She told him about the researchers, the reconstruction work, the small archive node that had been established at Kerrigan Station, which was close enough to a neutral junction point that several research institutions had agreed to co-fund it, and which he could visit if he wanted to. He visited it. It was not the Red Forest. It was a small room with rendered images and audio reconstructions, and carefully archived text translated into the 6 most widely used galactic languages, and it was nothing like being inside the warmth of the Covenant encoding. But it was a room where Yael's people existed, where before it had been a closed file, and a closed file was a different kind of nothing. He stood in the small room for a while. He felt the warmth in his chest quieter than it had been in the months of active transfer, but present, as it would always be present. The frequency his body had learned. The river running over the same stones long enough that the stones had taken on its pattern. He thought about resonance, both places vibrating at the same frequency, both places real at once. He sent Yael a message that said, "The archive is good. They got the light right in the rendered images." She replied 11 minutes later, "The third-hour forest light is very close. The music is still not right. I am working on the music. He sat in the small room at Kerrigan Station for a while longer, with 236,000 lives, warm and quiet in his chest. And outside the viewport, the stars moved at their ancient and indifferent pace, enormous and patient, and wholly unconcerned with everything that had happened and everything that was still to come between the points of their light. He was all right with that. He had work to do. He went back to it.